Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peter Cook. I have the absolute privilege and pleasure of being here this afternoon with three great people. We have Rachel Ashley, who's a singer and entertainer and voiceover artist up in Cheshire. We have Cathy Reynolds, who's been previously a politician and is actually studying for a PhD at this time. And of course, at the top of the bill, we have Sajjad Karim, who was an MEP and is still smiling about the matter and joins us today from Brussels. Good afternoon, Saj.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Okay. Now we start with a big question. We've had 4.5 years of vacillation. I liken this to the generation game where there are thousands of issues on a conveyor belt, like the Northern Ireland Agreement, the trade, alternative arrangements, and all these things that have gone round and round and round and round. And today we are told that we're 99% there, but for the fish. So I'm kind of wondering, what's your appraisal of where we are now vis-a-vis a Brexit deal, no deal? You know, if you can discount the last 4.5 years, that would be helpful to give us an answer. But take us through where you see where we are now, really.
It's really interesting, actually. Well, I did see that statement of 95% there, and I laughed. And the reason for it was this, that in 16, 17 years of being involved in negotiating international trade agreements, we were always able to say right at the outset, at the start of the process, that actually even before we've started speaking to one another, we know that we've got 80% done. And what would then happen right at the very last stage is we would always find ourselves in a position to say that 95% is now done, because it would be technical, the first 80%, and then you'd have about another 15% of which was technical but politically related, and then of course you'd have the very last 5%, which was entirely political decision making that needed to be done to allow the deadlock to be unlocked. So actually, in many ways, we are where we were on day one. Right from day one, we knew as soon as the red lines were set that actually 95% of this is fine. It's the 5%, the political decisions, and they just simply haven't been dealt with. So it sounds great on the face of it, but actually, unless those political decisions are made within the next few days, we are exactly where we were on day one.
Political decisions around the world can be made and unmade, and the law sometimes adjusts to fit them. But we have seen the breaking of international law by Boris Johnson in a limited and specific way, of course. It's like saying, I just run someone over, I only run over their arm, and they're still all right. So how do you see the sort of the psychological contract in terms of the political will, given that we are seeming to be prepared to break international laws in order to get this done? Is that a good look in Brussels?
No.
A loaded question.
Yeah. But you know, actually, there is a little bit of history that we're forgetting. And we just need to remind ourselves. The United Kingdom today is saying that it's willing to break international law. It is absolutely shocking, of course, for everybody. But there's something we did earlier in the process, which was equally shocking. When we were dealing with the rights of EU citizens to be able to remain in the United Kingdom, we said to them that they would have to go through a further process to establish their rights to remain after Brexit. Actually, each and every one of those people had exercised their legitimate legal right under the freedom of movement provisions to come and enter the United Kingdom. So what we were actually doing at that time is telling them that they had to re-regularize their already regular status. Now, when it comes to playing fast and loose with how the law works, that was the first shot that was fired under Brexit that fundamentally changed the very basis upon which our society is actually built. Because we were retrospectively taking away people's legally given and exercised rights and asking them to once again re-establish those same rights under a new process and procedure. Now, that is not the basis, the legal basis upon which our society in the United Kingdom is built. And therefore, actually, it came as no surprise to me when we moved on to the next stage. It was inevitable. You know, these things don't stop there. That's the first step. You've then got to be ready for what comes next. And therefore, the breach of international law, after we have breached our domestic provisions, which provided obligations under European law and thereby international law, to move on to saying we are now willing to breach international law in itself, ought really not to have come as a surprise to anybody.
So actually following on from that, the manifesto didn't specify about the breaking of international law in order to get Brexit done. That's a new development. And as I understand it, whereas the House of Lords eventually have to capitulate if there's a manifesto commitment, they don't have to capitulate if it's not a manifesto promise. Am I right in thinking that that's correct in strict sort of legal terms, that they can continue to resist?
Well, I'm actually no expert in terms of procedures of the British parliamentary system. But what I do know is this, that we are heading towards, well, we've already been through a number of mini constitutional crises, and we are quite clearly heading towards a very major and fundamental constitutional crisis at some stage fairly soon, before this whole Brexit saga and palaver is over. Just cast your mind back to how this entire enterprise has been carried out. It has been carried out in a step-by-step approach. And actually, Brexit is not the end point. Brexit is just one further step towards a complete refashioning of the type of society that we are. And a part of that refashioning actually requires there to be a constitutional crisis. So I see this actually as a very deliberate ploy by the government of the day to force a crisis. And every step, it takes us one step further, in the sense that they come up with a bigger crisis than the last one. I mean, there's a pattern, I'm a lawyer by profession, and we do deal with things forensically.
Yeah.
And we look for patterns of behavior. Just look at what is happening here, and that pattern is very well established. And this will keep happening until ultimately we get to a stage where either the House of Lords finds itself in a position that it is so absolutely outraged by what it is being asked to do that it cannot find any way of justifying that action, or it finds itself in a position that it actually has to step in order to prevent the monarch from ultimately being embarrassed. And that's one of the two scenarios that we will arrive at some stage. Now, whether it happens under the current process that's underway remains to be seen. But you're quite right, it wasn't a manifesto commitment. But then please, let's not forget, the referendum was not legally binding either.
Yes. Now, shortages of chicken drumsticks in January seem rather trivial in comparison with what you've just said. So I'm going to then move us on. I think it isn't Rachel. I think it's Catherine who's got the first set of questions on this occasion. Am I right?
I think so, Peter, yes.
Go on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Sajjad. COVID has really thrown a bit of a spanner in the works, I think, over the last 12 months, because that clearly was never part of anybody's plan. From our reading of it, the economic damage done because of the pandemic already, combined with economic damage that will happen whenever we leave the European Union transition period, simply because any deal is not going to give us the sort of deal that we had when we were a full member. And the combination is going to be catastrophic for the United Kingdom. That's our reading of it. How do you see the impact of COVID and Brexit together on the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I mean, this is quite clearly quite reckless behaviour. I cannot think of any other time where a government has actually made a decision that goes against the interests of the people that they serve. But just look at the situation as it is at this moment in time. So far as COVID-19 is concerned, there is very little the government can do to arrest COVID-19. They can try and put in place measures to deal with the effects of it, but you have no real control over the arrest of it. The development of a vaccine is something that you have some control towards as a global player. And that is something that you ought to be moving on positively. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, yes, this is happening at a global level. People are playing their part. So you have some extent of control over what you do there. But what you cannot do is just simply determine that now there is a vaccine and it's to be implemented. No, this requires time, there's regulation, there's processes, research and development. We're all hearing that we're almost there. It's a fantastic achievement. You know, let's see how quickly it can actually be turned around. What is the one thing that you actually have got absolute control over? And that is a decision to extend the transition period. And that one decision in itself would take away the immediate impact and source of what we are facing at this moment in time. And that is something that was absolutely in the control of the government. It chose not to exercise that. It's still choosing not to exercise that. And I can tell you from the conversations that I've had here in Brussels over the last few days, it seems that now the aim is to have a transition out of the transition phase. So rather than, so rather than have an end at midnight, we will have an end at midnight, but certain things will carry on and slowly we will transition out of those. So, you know, we'll have to wait and see what happens. But I just want to go back to a point that was raised earlier in relation to how far down the line we are with the deal. And this once again plays into the ideological arguments as opposed to pragmatism. And that comes into the whole issue of extending transition as well. We're told, as we've already said, that we're 95% there. Well, of the issues that remain, one of the main, of course, is the whole issue of fishing rights and the setting of quotas. Now, we have decided that we are going to walk away from being in the single market, the customs union, and the digital single market.
Mm-hmm.
The digital agenda is the #1 growth area for future economies. And we have decided, based upon ideology, that we are going to surrender all of that for our fishing industry, which is a minute part of our economy with absolutely zero future growth potential.
Mm.
So when you have a government in place that's willing to make a decision on ideology in that format, it's very difficult to see them make a pragmatic decision on extending transition. They will stick to the ideology of Brexit, even though that is the one issue that they have got absolute control over.
That isn't what a sensible government would do, is it?
And hence I'm sat where I am now.
Mm. Let's just sort of imagine for a minute that common sense did begin to prevail. If the British government went to the European Union and said, okay, we realise this is going to be extremely difficult for the United Kingdom because we haven't got a deal in place and we are still coping with the pandemic because, as you quite rightly say, although there is a vaccine on the horizon, actually getting to a point when anything can get back to normal is quite some months away yet at the very earliest. So if the British government did go to Brussels and say, can we extend the transition period by 12 months? As far as you're aware, would the European Union actually agree to that?
Well, one of the things that I very quickly learnt about the European Union, actually one of the things that attracted me to come here was the pragmatism with which the European Union conducts its business. And one of the things that I really learned very quickly after arriving here was some of the very many techniques in which the European Union goes about doing this. And it's very clear to me, based upon the very exceptional circumstances, that not just the UK, but the EU is also facing. The European Union is very well versed in ensuring that pragmatic solutions can be provided to deal with unprecedented situations. And this falls fairly and squarely into that category. The European Union would not hesitate for a second in working out and providing a solution that worked for everybody to allow us to get through this. You know, it's a very pragmatic place. And this is a thing that annoys people here and annoys me as well. There are parts of the British media that are presenting the European Union as the side that is being ideologically driven. And that could not be further from the truth. It's against the nature of what the European Union is.
So when we're told by people who say, oh, I voted Remain, but there's nothing we can do now, that's not strictly true, is it?
It's not true at all. This causes me great frustration. And I speak as a centre-right British politician. Somebody who is pragmatic. I don't have an ideological bone in my body. And I find most Remainers fit into a category of, fairly pragmatic people. And when I hear them say this, to me, it sounds as though they've actually been literally beaten to a point of just giving up.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, and that's actually not only a sad situation, but it's a very dangerous situation
Yes.
for a population to be in.
I'm going to bring up a controversial name at this point, Sarge, Tony Blair, who actually used the contrast that you're making, so that it used to be the Labour Party that were confused about the contrast from ideology over pragmatism. And I've always warned against it, I think he said, because it's always caused us to lose elections. But the very same disease seems to have overtaken these Brexiteers.
Well, it's the extremes. But, you know, I'm a centrist.
Yeah.
You know, when you go to the extremes, whether it's the right or the left, you are automatically into dogma and ideology. And Tony Blair had to fight it on the left. We, unfortunately, as a party, as the Conservative Party, have succumbed to those forces on the right. They today have control of executive decision making on behalf of the entirety of the United Kingdom, and that, you know, in the end, I'm afraid, is simply going to put not just pressure on United Kingdom standing at a global stage, or indeed as part of a European family, either in or out of the European Union, but actually it's going to provide challenges to the integrity of the United Kingdom and Great Britain itself to such an extent that they are not going to be sustainable.
Rather than follow that up, can I take you back? You said you're a centre-right politician. Now, I did notice on your Wikipedia page that in August you came out in support of Sir Keir Starmer as leader of the opposition. Could you explain? I'm actually a member of the Labour Party. I will admit to being a member of the Labour Party, and I just wondered what your thinking was around that comment.
No, I mean, the BBC pulled me up on this, and all the headlines, well, the few headlines that were generated, they were all about how I was coming out in favour of Keir Starmer. I wasn't. What actually, yeah, what actually,
I thought you'd had a conversion.
I have many friends in the Labour Party, many friends in the Liberal Democrats.
We're used to conversions here in Edinburgh, of course.
And what actually happened that day was that the British government had absolutely failed to speak out for the international law protections that were afforded to asylum seekers.
Yes.
And in fact, the Home Secretary had done the exact opposite and attacked the very legal basis that asylum seekers act under. And Keir Starmer put out a message actually based upon the situation under international law. And I just felt it right as a conservative. Many of us conservatives today were finding ourselves reliant upon the leader of the Labour Party to be speaking out for our values. And that really was a wake-up call to the Conservative Party leadership that this is not the way this is supposed to be. So that's what it was. But of course, as you know, media spin and all the rest of it, it you know, got dealt with in quite a different way. But that doesn't worry me. You know, as long as it shook up the leadership of the Conservative Party, you know, it served its purpose. I certainly didn't get a call of thanks from Keir, though.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Sajjad.
You've taken us on a real roller coaster so far in this conversation. The highs being the pragmatism of the European Union, the lows being the ideological stickiness of the whatever is going on in number 10, whatever that is. So it seems to me that there are three possibilities. There could be no deal, which we're led to believe there is a lot of money riding on that. There could be a thin deal. There could be an extension by another name. We're hearing this a lot in the last week or so. There is also another possibility, and your talk of the pragmatic nature of the European Union. Would there be any legal methods of suspending Brexit? Which do you think of those, I suppose, four things is most likely to happen? The no deal to get the hedge fund bets paid off, a very thin deal. I don't know if they would still get paid off for that. I don't know. An extension by another name. And if there was an extension by another name, could that be a precursor to some kind of suspension of the whole thing, please?
Yeah. Normally when one's dealing with international trade negotiations, you have a really good feel and understanding of where the other side actually is. Here we're in a very, very different situation. And just let's talk through these scenarios. Boris Johnson agrees to a deal, thick or thin. And he then gets that pushed through. What's his numbers in Westminster? What are the numbers of MPs within the Conservative Party that would allow him or would allow him to be challenged as leader for having done so? Conversely, he takes the view that actually politically it's more expedient just to undergo a no-deal Brexit, simply on the basis that the harm that's being done under a no-deal Brexit situation isn't that different because of COVID today from a very, very thin deal. And therefore you may as well take the hit, because then you are avoiding the problem of being removed by your own MPs.
And you've got a handy excuse.
A no-deal situation. So if you want to carry on as Prime Minister, then you've got to go with a no-deal scenario. If, however, you were to come forward with a deal, you will very soon find yourself under tremendous pressure from your own MPs, potentially facing a removal. So that's the political calculation that he has to make. Of course, a responsible Prime Minister in whose mind the only consideration is the national interest will act in a way that delivers a deal and thereby helps reduce the level of harm that's going to be caused and provides a very smooth transition out of the transition. That's the two different personalities that you're looking at. Now, whether Boris Johnson can transition from one to the other is the question.
If anybody can, he probably can.
Well, he's made some very conflicting decisions in the past. And therefore, he certainly has the ability to do it. But if it means that he's going to put his premiership at risk, that's where the balancing decision between personal and national interest comes into it. And I've certainly always been of the view that, if one is national leader, then the very last question on your mind needs to be, well, what is this going to do for my position?
Given that there could be an extension at the top of our roller coaster ride of a conversation, is there any kind of legal process that could lead to a suspension of Brexit?
Yeah, I mean, the legal position is the United Kingdom has actually left the European Union. We are under a transition process, and if that transition process gets extended, then we remain out of the European Union, but operating under the transition process. A very interesting question, however, is that, of course, the United Kingdom constitutionally has the ability to say that, yes, we would actually like to rejoin the European Union. Now, a country seeking to rejoin the European Union whilst under a transition process is in quite a different position politically, not legally, politically, to a country that is wanting to rejoin the European Union from outside of a transition process. Now, the European Union, as I've said before, is a very pragmatic place. And if the United Kingdom was to try and seek to rejoin while still being in the transition process, the European Union would find a way.
I like that answer.
Yeah. If, however, the transition has come to an end, then the United Kingdom, I'm afraid, is in the position of any other country that wants to join the European Union. You have got to come through the Copenhagen criteria and process.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah, and this is another thing as well that I've heard from people that, oh, well, you know, if we were to decide that we want to rejoin the European Union would be, you know, delighted, and, you know, we would be able to dictate the terms. I just, you know, it's British exceptionalism that has got us where we are today.
Yeah.
And I find that sort of attitude is British exceptionalism on steroids.
You said at the beginning that, you know, the ideology is just sort of fueling the whole debate. And the goal seems to be to, you know, to take the country to the brink. I think they're succeeding at that. And if we did a no deal, I think the country could in February be brought to the brink. And I'm wondering what your betting odds are. I know that solicitors don't do betting, but if you did for a moment, is this intended to bring the country to a point where people actually rise up and say that the COVID and Brexit catastrophe is too much? And would we then have to crawl back on our knees under no deal? And would that be good for our English hubris?
It's a really interesting question, and one I have been giving, as you can imagine, quite a lot of thought to. Most of the people that voted for Brexit, despite all of the evidence that is before them today, find it incredibly difficult to say that these consequences are because of that particular decision. They are always able to try and find something else to blame it on, including Remainers.
Yes.
Blaming it on Remainers is one of the core things. But I mean, that's the politics of it. The other part of it, I mean, this really worries me. Brexit as an exercise is a part of a much larger equation. And it's a step-by-step, by any means necessary exercise. It doesn't finish there. I mean, look at how the very basis upon which our society is built, the legal basis, today is so badly fractured. Look at how the very values that hold the United Kingdom bound together are now frayed. Look at how Scotland, on a values basis, can no longer really identify with much of England. And ultimately, what is it that holds a union together? It's values. And then you build your union and its structures through a legal process based on those values. That's what held us in the European Union. That's what's holding the United Kingdom together. So every step of the way in which Brexit is being carried out is not only harming our relations with the European Union, but actually it's pulling us apart internally as well. Now, if you have severe economic pressures come about after January for whatever reasons, that is going to further add to the speed with which you are actually undermining the integrity of the United Kingdom. Now, I'm finding in England today, there are anti-Scottish movements that have now started. Ironic as it is, in northeast England, which voted for Brexit, there are today minuscule, tiny little campaigns starting for them to break away from England and join with Scotland.
We shouldn't laugh, but because it's funny.
We shouldn't.
Well, I actually think that if this process, I think you're right, and I think it's been a long time in the planning. I think, you know, the first I heard of for example, Atlantic Bridge, you know, it was way back in the 80s, and I think that this plan has been a very long time in the coming. But I think that not only is the integrity of the United Kingdom at risk, definitely, you know, with Scottish secession and, you know, obviously Northern Ireland, potentially Wales. We know, being on the border, we know that Welsh nationalism is rising massively at the moment, and it's only a matter of time before the northern cities, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, are going to start feeling that kind of pressure against Westminster as well.
And
these are very dangerous times.
We already saw that as well, didn't we, over the COVID restrictions prior to the lockdown that we're in at the moment here in Britain, with Andy Burnham challenging Boris Johnson's authority very significantly and getting a great deal of good press about it. So, you know, he was dubbed the King of the North.
And I used to spend time on Downing Street, Saj, as a joke, telling people, because I am a scientist and I study complexity and things, that as things unwind, contagion happens. And I used to say to people, you think it's funny that Scotland will leave, but sooner or later England will be the People's Republic of Thurrock. And that is an exaggeration by a long way. But of course, you're illustrating how that contagion starts to take place.
Yeah, the very first time I spoke about these dangers was back in 2014. I gave an interview to the press, and you can imagine political circles in Westminster came down on me like a ton of bricks, because quite clearly I was talking about things that was just, you know, scaremongering. And I still have that. In fact, a very good friend of mine sent me the link to that article just a few weeks ago, reminding me, saying, you need to read this again. And I did, and I was, you know, I just wish, I just wish it wasn't this particular way, but it is. So that aspect I find truly, truly worrying, because the Scottish elections in May are clearly going to bring about an SNP majority. Now, just look at the sequence of events that's unfolded here. You have a referendum offered to the Scottish people where they have to, in effect, make a decision between being in two unions or in none. And they choose that they want to remain in the United Kingdom and thereby in the European Union. They are then offered a further referendum where they reaffirm that decision and say, no, we want to remain in the European Union. So the Scottish position is abundantly clear. They want to be in the United Kingdom, and they want the United Kingdom to be in the European Union. Okay? The problem is England and Wales, between them, are pulling Scotland and Northern Ireland out of the European Union. That's what's actually happening here.
Mm.
Thereafter, look at what has happened in the 2 general elections that have taken place in terms of the Scottish results. On both occasions, they have sent back a majority of SNP MPs on a platform opposed to a no-deal Brexit.
Mm.
This time round, they are going to actually be fighting a national election in Scotland, making it clear that they want a further referendum to make their position clear. So if the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom then refuses a further democratic call from them, this would now be the 5th. 2 referendums, 2 general elections, and now a 5th call from them to have the right to reaffirm their decision and their position. The more that the British Prime Minister refuses to give them that opportunity, the more you are walking towards them reaffirming that actually they want their original decision to stand, and that is that they want to remain now in the European Union, and if it means going independent to do so, that is what they are going to do.
Has the fact that President Trump did not get re-elected in America made any real significant difference to any of this?
Well, it's really interesting. We today now find ourselves in a situation where the USA and the European Union are now back on the same page. And they're back on the same page on multilateralism. They're back on the same page, more or less, in terms of how we deal with the balance between the East and the West. They're back on the same page of repairing and rebuilding the Western alliance. And they're back on the same page on Ireland, on Northern Ireland, and the Good Friday Agreement. And the United Kingdom breaks the Good Friday Agreement at its own peril. Because the USA is committed to it, the European Union is committed to it. And if the United Kingdom isn't committed to it, then it's going to have to live by the consequences of the lack of that commitment.
It remains for all of us, I think, to thank you so much for those deep insights. I mean, there just isn't enough time. We could go on for hours, but I think this is more than enough to get us thinking. And more than enough, the key point is, can we suspend, or is it all over? And the answer is it's not, by a long chalk.
And the only thing I will say is, I might be sat in Brussels at the moment, but it doesn't mean I've left the United Kingdom or Great Britain. And certainly I make no secret of the fact that should the political opportunity ever arise for people like me to be able to re-enter into British politics, to get us back as a country into a much more sensible place, then I certainly as one will seize it with both hands. And I hope I'll have support from many, many friends from across the political spectrum if that opportunity ever comes along.
I think you'll be very, very welcome.
Yeah, I do as well.
And please let the people in Brussels know that we're still here and we're still fighting.
I do every day.
Thank you.
Thank you.